Welcome to my 7th 8th-inch garden railway project. I recently built this railway in my backyard along a fence line. I was really new to garden railways and also live steam locomotives, so it was quite a journey for me. I'm going to step you through some of the construction I went through as well as provide some video run-bys towards the end. My name is William Lawson and I'm located in Columbus, Ohio in the U.S. I want to point out that where I live, we have 4 distinct seasons, including a cold winter. So while my garden railway stays up in the backyard all year round, I only operate it part of the time. The railway, as I mentioned, is a 7/8 N2 gauge, basically meaning that in the 7/8 inch scale, or 7/8 inch to the foot in actual life, this would be a 2-foot narrow gauge railway. The scale is 1 to 13.7. So basically, this uses the same track that G-gauge locomotives like LGB would run on, but because the larger scale, it's only a 2-footer narrow gauge line. The configuration is simply a single line along my fence row with return loops at each end. On each of the return loops, I have a spring switch so I can have continuous running. There's also a trestle on the west end. I have about 110, maybe 120 feet of track. It is code 250 aluminum rail that's been painted a dark brown, and it's been spiked onto treated wood ties. I do a few structures, which you'll see in the video later, a mine building, tipple, station platform. I only have one locomotive, which is a live steam 040, which is the Emma, made by AccuCraft. It is the same scale, 7/8 inch to the foot. It's fairly hefty. It probably weighs 10 to 11 pounds. I do have a few pieces of rolling stock, 2 flat cars, and 1 box car. So for a good overview, here's some selected images from the railway. Let me just give you a few moments to kind of look that over. Gives you a good general feel. This shows the basic configuration. Now about the eastern 3/4 or 2/3 of the railway is on a raised bed, garden, earthen type bed. And then towards the west, as you can see, it's elevated. That's mostly a trestle and then the west loop. And this view shows some of the vegetation, a little more detail around the layout. In addition to the elevated west loop and the east loop, I've also named a few locations on the railway. McGrath Gap Trestle is named after a good friend of mine, Ron McGrath, who's been my live steam mentor and helped me as I've worked on this project. Midway Station Platform, because it's midway between the west loop and east loop. And Buchanan Ridge, named after a good friend, Dave Buchanan, who provided an important tool, a tamper for me to use while I was constructing the layout, and also provided or donated the rocks for Buchanan Ridge. So for track construction, I used treated wood. I cut into approximately 3/4 by 5 1/4 inch ties. And I would start with large boards and rip them in my table saw and then use the miter saw to get the right lengths. This shows a stack over here on the left. Of course, I had to make probably about 1,000 ties for this project. This is a template, a curved template that I created. And over on the right, you get the basic idea of how this works. Mount the aluminum rail directly onto the ties. I didn't use any tie plates, just spike them on there. This is the gauge I used. So the process was to lay a template on the workbench and space my ties out on that template, and then I would attach two stringers, one on either side, the length of the track section, and I would attach those stringers also with treated wood with galvanized brads that I used with the pneumatic or air gun. Just some more images of the construction process. And then once I had the ties with the stringers attaching them, I would flip that over, and then I would spike the rail down using spikes, just manually with a spike driver. I, of course, painted the aluminum rail a dark brown after I cleaned it, and spray painted it a brown, and then let that dry before I, of course, would mount. Some more views of construction. In this case, one of the loops, I just basically cut small angled pieces of wood, joined them, and then I would later spike the ties and the rail. At the left is a loop section with the ties placed on and the spiking begun, as you can see towards the top. To the right is a rail bender that I fashioned that I just placed in a vise. It has 3 rollers on nuts and bolts. I wasn't trying to reach an exact curvature. I just wanted to take some of the straight pieces and get some bend or curve into them before I spike them to the loops. Section of curved track. For this railway line, I just constructed 2 Y switches. And I didn't use many commercial parts other than the stock rail. I did get 2 plastic frogs, and I also had to purchase some springs, which I'll talk about in a moment. I took the template from, I believe, the Fast Track's website and enlarged it so it was the right scale, basically 2 feet wide in the 1/7 inch scale, and had created some oversized ties and placed my template on that and just spiked directly on that. It took me a while to get it right, but I finally was able to figure out how the frog goes together with some help from the vendor and get things attached and working okay. I had to shave the edges of the rails and so forth so they would all fit in there and the wheels would move to the right or left as appropriate. So here's a view of a completed switch, and on the right is a close-up of the mechanism I used. I wanted a spring switch, so once a train went through the switch and around the loop, it would automatically be able to break through the switch by sliding it back, and then once the train passed, it would spring back to its original position. This way I wouldn't have to run back and forth manually switching at each loop when I enjoyed watching the train run. As you can see, after just shaving and filing down the end points so they would lean up against the rail, I mounted the end of these points to some flat aluminum stock and placed it between these 2 ties, added my spring with a rod. So obviously it just always keeps the switch in this position, and after it goes around and opens the switch and train goes through, it just springs back to this position. Now here's a view of the trestle that I constructed inside the garage. It's quite long. As you can see, I also left a couple long ties there for a platform. So this next series of slides just covers the roadbed preparation and track laying. At the left, you get the general idea of what I did. I would prepare the ground, dig kind of a trench or channel, put landscape cloth below that to prevent future weed growth, and then I put some angular gravel and tried to level that out and tamp that down the best I reasonably could. After which I would take my track sections already assembled in my garage and prepared and spiked. I would bring them out, place them on that newly prepared roadbed, and once I got it set up and somewhat leveled, then I added a finer angled gravel as ballast, uh, poured that ballast in there, and then kind of smoothed it out and cleared it off with a broom. And some other images of the roadbed and track lane process. It turned into quite a construction project. I think it took me about 4 to 5 months, basically I think around May or June until about October of the year to complete the basic line. I used probably about 1 ton of gravel, and I have a small pickup truck. I would get the bulk gravel, bring it around from the driveway to the back of the yard with my wheelbarrow and pile it up here and then distribute it as needed. While a good part of the line, as I mentioned earlier, was built on kind of an existing flower bed or landscape bed, I did have to add some fill towards the end of that and build this kind of retaining wall with some bricks. Some other pictures of the line. It did have to kind of weave around some trees partway through as shown on the left. Now these are some images of the east loop. On the left you can see it's still under construction, isn't quite connected up to the rest of the line. And on the right we've got a complete loop with the spring switch in the lower left of this image. Landscaping is still rough over here, but I will clean that up later. Vegetation control is always an issue even after I constructed the line. Not only are you clearing out vegetation and such to build the line, but then in terms of maintenance, you get vines creeping across the rail and so forth. I think the landscape cloth will probably help a lot over time, but it still requires some maintenance. So the trestle was installed starting with the raised garden or flower bed over here by the retaining wall, and it extends from here over to the west loop, which is not shown in these images. As you can see, I created some platforms, supports underneath the trestle and placed those on bricks for foundation. Now these images give you an idea of how the west loop was constructed. Of course, we're now off of the raised flower bed, so everything over here has to be elevated. I have kind of a dip in my yard towards a storm drain in the corner of the yard. So basically, I constructed a square frame and placed my supports on that, and then the rail and the ties on that. This is actually a picture of the west loop after I was doing some reconstruction. After I originally constructed it, I found that the angles were just a little too tight here, curving from the circle and back into the line. So this is an image taken on the left here of when I worked to ease the angle. So you can see over here there's a pile of ties which I had removed, and I'm kind of reconfiguring the rail a little bit to have a smoother, more gradual curvature. And then this is more the final look at that after on the right side here, after I had made that change. So when I was building the railway, I had a track gauge, and I occasionally used this car, which is an old LGB German four-wheel coach. I would use that on at least some of the sections here and there to test things. But later, I took that coach, and as you can see, added a brick inside of it and put a string on it. And I used that to pull around and kind of check out the line to see if it was working okay. We weren't having a lot of derailments. I really didn't have a lot of equipment. This old LGB coach, I think I had some LGB track maybe left. I have a section or two, but really didn't have a lot of my rolling stock ready as I was building the line. So I just had to kind of make do But this test car really did the trick. So here's a panoramic view of the Garden Railway, really before any structures, I think, have been added. From the west loop to the east loop, there's probably 110 to 120 feet of track. The loops take up probably 22, 24 or so, 26 feet by the time you go from the switch and all the way around the loop. So what's left is probably 50 to 60 linear feet with some slight curvatures between the loops. So my friend Ron's FN3 Shay was really the first live steam locomotive to run on the line and to test it. Even though it's a smaller scale, it's still the same gauge, and it worked pretty well. There was a hiccup over by the west loop. We had to end up unspiking some track and moving it over a little bit so it was a better curve, but then the Shay operated very well. This particular unit, I think maybe the way it's geared and the size of the wheels being so small, it just runs very well on this Garden Railway. So in terms of structures, I've constructed a few so far. Probably the major one is this tipple, and it kind of looks like a coaling tower. On the loops, I wanted to do things so they didn't look like just the entire loop and that's all it was. So I wanted to block the view a little bit, make it a little more interesting instead of just someone watching it go right around a loop. So on the west end, I put this structure, and as you can see on the right-hand image, it straddles the track, and it actually has a purpose besides being decorative. It also holds gravel for track repairs. Another structure I constructed was this small platform for the Midway station. So Midway is in between the two loops, Midway, and just basically a platform on some legs with steps. Very portable. I could probably bring it in during the winter time. And the other major structure that goes on the west loop is this mine building. I call it mine number 3. And the building just is designed to, again, straddle the tracks, something for the trains to go through. Now, if anyone is from the U.S. and especially the state of Ohio and is familiar with the Cedar Point Amusement Park, they might think this building looks a little familiar. There's a roller coaster ride. It's the Mine Ride. I'm not sure the exact name, but it's at Cedar Point Amusement Park, and this roller coaster has a building very similar to that. So I kind of got that inspiration or idea from the amusement park for my own layout. And just some other images of the mine building. It just made of plywood with the inside framing. I just created with the circular saw lines on the side to make it kind of look like it was planking on the side of the building. It does have a real metal roof, however. I can't say it's leak proof, but it is a real metal roof. And on the right is just a flat car with the mine building placed over the track. I think it turned out pretty nicely. I could probably still add something for windows. It's a fairly primitive structure, but it's a nice enhancement. Now, it's not my intention to make this a fully detailed garden railway with lots of structures and figures and vehicles, but I am adding some elements. For example, I've added these figures. These were figures I just purchased from a hobby store chain, and they're just resin figures. They're actually 1/12 scale, where I'm really closer to 1/14 scale, but they're pretty close. They were already painted. I just kind of weathered them by adding some oil paints to kind of accentuate the shadows and facial features and so forth, but they're working pretty well for my purposes. The figure on the left is inside the mine, and of course the figure on the right is on our Midway station platform. Now the smaller barrels on the previous slide I bought from a hobby store, but the larger ones I actually made. I recently acquired a wood lathe and had really never used a wood lathe before. So this was a good little project to kind of learn about it. On the left picture here shows a couple, at least two barrels, looks like being made. Just basically shape them out, and then in the middle are some little more finished state of them. On the right is a barrel I've taken and I hollowed out part of the top and added, I think, some polyurethane or something of that nature to make it appear like water, and then of course painted it and labeled it fire so it can be a water barrel. That, at least in the US, I think historically on the old wooden trestles, they would place these water barrels to help put out fires on wooden trestles. And so that kind of represents that. So I think it turned out pretty well. Happy with the result. It isn't probably the best wood to use. You can see some chips and roughness, but after all, this is an outdoor railway, so it should work fine. So let's now take a look at rolling stock. I've got a couple flat cars and a box car. For the flat cars, what I used was the LGB four-wheel German coach. And I essentially just used the chassis and wheels from those and removed the coach body and cut off the LGB couplers and replaced them with large-scale Kadee couplers. And I built this flatbed structure that they could be mounted onto. The LGB wheels I did not keep. I replaced those with metal wheels, really because I wanted extra weight for these cars. And that's why you also see the weight, for example, in the middle on the image of the left. I added some steel weight to both of the cars because I need weight to break through the spring switches. When you go around those, you need a lot of weight to open those up. And I even have to add weight on to these when I run them, additional cargo on there, rocks or tools or something like that. In addition, I've added some details from a company called Ozark Miniatures out of Utah. For example, look at the image on the right, the stirrups, the post holders, the nuts on the end, the handbrake. Those were all purchased from there and make nice additions to the pieces. Now the boxcar was basically scratch built except for the trucks and couplers and again some more accessories from Ozark Miniatures. Dealing in this scale, 7/8 inch to the foot, you can really see how big this equipment is. This isn't a big table, it's our breakfast nook table. It's probably like 4 feet across or so, but you can see a placemat, how big the boxcar under construction is. I mean, these are actually wood clamps used for wood projects, like if you're making a shelf or something like that. You can see in the distance a cutter there, and I assembled this with wood glue, let it set up. Here you can see it nearly complete with a lot of the accessories added. I added just a styrene plastic roof and then added a walkway on the top. Here's one of the trucks from Ozark Miniatures. It is the proper gauge. It's approximately 2 feet wide for my scale, 7/8 inch. The truck itself is smaller. I think it's probably more designed for FN3, so it looks a little small. I mean, for my purposes, it's okay, but it's a little on the small side. You can see that inside I weighted each side with parts of a brick that I cut off and just kind of framed those in either end. And there's a near complete image of the car. Again, I have to have this weight here so they can make it through the spring switches. And just some other views of the car. Funny story here, that handbrake you see, when I first ran that boxcar on the railway, when I went through the mine building, it got plucked right off. It was just too tall, so I've got to go back and fix that. The clearance just wasn't enough. So here's the same car placed outside on the line. This is at Buchanan Ridge. And I was, again, pretty happy with the results of this. I think it looks fairly realistic. Just images of the finished end loops. On the left is the west end loop with the structures, and on the right is the east loop with some vegetation. Again, didn't want to just leave the loops to be bare and just simple circles to go around, but wanted to kind of block some of the view and hide the train a little bit, make it a little more interesting for people watching. So the next several slides will just show some videos, very brief, just some run-bys and a little bit of steaming up the Emma. Hope you enjoy them.
Hey, baby.
So just to close things out here, it was an interesting project. Got to try a lot of new and different things. I'd never really worked with that large of a scale, that significantly, and compared to electric trains, for example, this is a lot more, I think, of a mechanical venture. You're dealing with bigger parts. You're dealing with real wood and hauling rock around and putting the level out there in the ground, and it's kind of a little closer towards prototype railroading, just a little bit, not fully, of course. So I think I'm pretty much done with the layout. I might put some building flats in the back along the fence at the midway station and do some tweaking, maybe add some more figures and some accessories. Not great details, but just add some interest. So I hope you do enjoy what we've covered here, and if you have any remarks, please feel free to comment below. Thank you.